I can. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming this afternoon in support of our event this afternoon. There are a few housekeeping details. We have our chat box being monitored by the New York Women's Foundation and JAC members. We also want this to be an interactive process as much as possible. We will try to answer and move through the program, but also being mindful of your questions in the chat box. And the New York Women's Foundation's Justice Advisory Committee is engaging in a conversation this afternoon about undoing the normalization of violence against women. And before we begin, we want to share a little bit more about JAC, which stands for Justice Advisory Committee. In September 2018, the New York Women's Foundation launched a 7-year criminal justice initiative and a collaborative fund with the goal of helping to dismantle mass incarceration for women, transgender, non-binary individuals and families in New York City. The foundation established an advisory committee made up directly of system-impacted women, trans, and non-binary individuals, with the goal of helping to advance the objectives and strategies of this initiative. This also includes helping to identify emerging needs and trends on the ground, as well as providing input and support on key efforts related to grant making, thought leadership, community engagement, and ongoing policy campaigns. So we thank you very much for joining us today for the Justice Advisory Committee's Thought Leadership event. So we also want to continue, and prior to that, I want to share a bit more of who I am, and that I am also a member of the Justice Advisory Committee. I'm Nadja Encarnacion, and I've come on to JAC with experience having worked with court-involved young people at Exalt Youth, and having had a lot more community engagement with young people over the last 15 years. And so it's been an absolute pleasure to be part of JAC for about a little over 2 years now. And it's been an incredible experience having the opportunity to meet other individuals that have been directly impacted by the criminal legal system, and how we've come together as a collective to create what we envision for our current society. And that I will continue to expound on. So the Justice Advisory Committee has a vision of a world where women, transgender, and non-binary individuals can walk on the streets in peace without fear. Can we be a community of love where no judgment exists? Can we be free to love and live as we choose? However, it seems like we're not quite there yet. Unfortunately, the United States social and justice systems continue to normalize the violent treatment of women. And we're taking a look today to see how that legacy is deeply rooted from slavery, and therefore has been embedded in the current systems that have created generational and intergenerational damage, which continuously destroys women, TGNC, and their families, from mass incarceration to immigration, violence within these legal systems dressed up as justice, And today's conversation, Undoing the Normalization of Violence, takes a look at how violence has permeated through generations and the day-to-day actions which are needed to remedy this violence. There has been a considerable amount of denial or misrepresentation of these brutalities and the lasting effects of slavery on communities of color, especially women and TGNC individuals of color. Therefore, for many months, Jack has collaborated on an extensive and collectively creating a vision for a world without mass incarceration that includes violence against women. Far too long, violence has been normalized, and today's discussion will highlight how violence has impacted generations and individuals over these various systems throughout time. And this would include emotional violence, physical violence, institutional violence, such as jails and prisons, systemic violence, such as child welfare, abortion rights, immigration, and more. So, as we continue on this conversation, many of our JAC members will begin having a table discussion about this. Each member will be introducing themselves. And this afternoon, we're gonna have Tina begin and share more about the points that she will be discussing today. And prior to Tina beginning, I want to pose the question, what are ways that violence shows up in the criminal legal system and immigration? Tina, we welcome you.
Thank you, Nadia. I was on mute. Good afternoon, everyone. That was a beautiful introduction of Jack and yourself. I'm so happy to be a part of Jack. My name is Tina Reynolds, and I am a consultant. I've been in the criminal legal field for over 20 years, primarily focusing on the issues around women and girls and children and families, reproductive justice rights for women, both in New York and nationally. I'm so glad to be here and so glad to be a part of Jack. And this conversation, because this is near and dear to me, as my own personal experiences with violence through my venture into the criminal justice system. I certainly have experienced and tried to assist in changing legislation to prevent violence against women and girls and LGBTQ non-binary folks. So again, thank you. I'm going to start my conversation with giving some information from the Human Rights Commission and just some basic information just so that we know where we're starting. 1 in 3 women worldwide experience physical and sexual violence, mostly by an intimate partner. Violence against women and girls is a human rights violation, and the immediate and long-term physical, sexual, and mental consequences for women and girls can be devastating, including death. Violence negatively affects women's general well-being and prevents women from fully participating in society. It impacts their families, their communities, and the country at large. Violence is normalized. It's normalized within the intersections of these systems that Nadia mentioned, like ACS, human services, mental health and health, parole, probation, and the police. So much so that they continuously prevent women, girls, LGBTQ, non-binary folks from feeling safe within our society. The vast majority of women in prison have been victims of violence prior to their incarceration, including domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, and child abuse. Women who have been sentenced for violent crimes are even more likely to have been abused and to be incarcerated for responding to that abuse violently. And this continues within these systems. Why is it that we normalize violence? I want to ask, why is it that we sometimes stand back and now take out our phones and videotape violence that is meted out on people? Why is it that we do not respond? Why is it that we continue to understand that violence is rampant within the prison system, and that there are things that need to change? And how is it that we are going to change these systems that continuously look at women and girls and LGBTQ folk as second-class citizens? So that's what I'd like to bring to the conversation today. I'm glad to be a part of this conversation, and I look forward to speaking more about my thoughts around this issue. And I'd like to turn it back over to Nadia.
Thank you so much, Tina. And I want to thank one of our guests who did offer some feedback on your question, like why is it that we continue to allow violence to persist, right? Especially violence against women, LGBTQ, non-binary individuals. And Yusuf Bolden said desensitization, excuse me, of many topics or things, because perhaps many of us who haven't directly experienced that, right, couldn't be aware of these things. And thank you for that feedback and comment, because we want to have an open conversation as to how our current society, specifically in our country and the climate of our country, as we view individuals of color who identify as women, non-binary folks, LGBTQ, and what these systems continue to demonstrate currently. So we want to continue to allow our JAC members to discuss the points that they will continue to emphasize in the ways in which violence continues to show up. Tina, you did describe how it shows up a little bit, you know, in your current introduction, how it shows up in our criminal legal system. And I want to invite Diana and later Xena to discuss how it also is showing up and how we're currently dealing as a society and as a nation, immigration.
Hi everyone, my name is Diana. And in my bio, I always write, I am a daughter, I am an auntie, I'm a sister and a partner. I was formerly undocumented, and right now I'm currently working at an early diversion program in the Bronx. But previously I worked at the New York State Youth Leadership Council, which I always credit because it saved my life as a young undocumented woman who had just moved into New York City as a result of family separation. So I always carry and acknowledge that that's the place where I grew up and saved me. And that's why I'm very passionate about this question. So what are the ways in which violence shows up in the criminal legal system and immigration, in both what I've experienced, but also, what we continue to see? So I first wanted to acknowledge that, one, this is not something new, right? This is a pattern of history in American history of separation. And in some ways that shows up by, from the beginning of the creation of this nation, it favors certain types of immigrants versus others. There has been a separation of families, of children and kids and mothers by, either criminalizing certain communities, such as policies to secure communities, the zero tolerance policies, and, the rhetoric of anti-immigrant hate that allow for these things to happen, right? Another way it shows up and has shown up in history is the control of women's bodies or caregiving bodies in either forced sterilization, coerced in showing up in American history, or the blocking of reproductive health, such as abortion care at certain detention centers, whether that's, victims of rape or any other. It's just like the controlling of those bodies in, the Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. So those are some ways. And like I mentioned earlier, I myself, both in another state, but also living here, have been experience of the separation of family, of what it looks like firsthand on certain caregivers, right? And they tend to be like the parents, the mothers, the sisters, because when a family is experiencing the deportation or detention of a loved one, we have to step up to, one, be the advocate, to be the translator, and also just be the one that's like advocate, again, at the forefront, having to continue to help the family navigate this difficult situation. And so those are some ways that I've identified that shows up, but I know that Ximena brings a very valuable perspective to this conversation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Xena Ospina. I am currently a law student at the CUNY Law. I'm the CUNY School of Law. I am also the business fellow at the New York State Youth Leadership Council. I've done organizing around access to education for undocumented immigrants and, of course, trans issues. But because I'm a nerd, I want to answer this question in like a historical context kind of way. I do fully attribute the current immigration system to the legacy of slavery in the United States. Citizenship has always been a weapon of white supremacy. The people who created this country, who wrote the Constitution, did not intend to make enslaved people citizens. And later on, it was very made clear, and this is something I learned in law school because I just started in the Dred Scott decision, when one of the Supreme Court justices flat out said non-white people cannot be citizens. So citizenship has always been racialized, and it's always been connected to slavery and the dehumanization of Black folks. After the Civil War, in the 14th Amendment makes everyone born in the United States citizenship. The language around immigration, is different, but I think the legacy remains, particularly because what we know as Border Patrol is an offspring of slave catchers. So it never stopped. The slave catchers never really stopped existing. They just were put to new use of kicking out the immigrants. And by kicking out the immigrants, they really mean, as this country expanded westward, is kind of ethnically cleansing these areas from the non-citizens, which were mainly meant non-white people. So what normalizes this violence to this day is the law, and the sneaky ways that like the law, avoids sounding so violent. As it pertains to trans folks and queer folks immigrating to the United States, the McCarran-Walter Act, I believe, passed in the 50s, like prevented queer people from immigrating to the United States. If you were found to engage in subversive activities, you were not allowed in the country. Or you could be deported for subversive activities, mainly, homosexual acts, cross-dressing, as they would call it back then. So law has always targeted queer immigrants in particular. During the AIDS crisis, the Reagan administration put a travel ban on people with HIV, a travel ban that would not be lifted by Clinton nor Bush, neither of the Bushes, but by Obama almost 23 years later. So up until 2010, people with HIV were not legally allowed to immigrate. And that's just a few of the examples that show how what normalizes violence to me, I mean, yes, there's the component of kind of this modern world of sharing information and sharing violent videos, but I think that almost always the people who are doing egregious things try to back it up with the law if they can, as much as possible.
That's a great point, Jimena and Diana. Thank you so much for mentioning that. I was in conversation with a friend of mine when we think about the systems and within the law, and how much the impact is on people as they are returning home. And in the state of Illinois, there are 1,198 permanent punishments that prevent people who are returning from prison or jail from becoming full citizens. These 1,198 permanent punishments go back in history to the early 1900s and even further. So you're absolutely correct how systems of law prevent people from really becoming full citizens, dehumanizing continuously to criminalize people even after they've served their sentences, especially for women and girls. When we think about these permanent punishments, when we know that women are considered or not considered, or oftentimes invisibilized, when we think about LGBTQ non-binary folks invisibilized, and as violence is continuously perpetuated on them. We think about what are the other permanent punishments within other states, because each state is an island unto itself, in my knowledge. You know, so how is it that we can address these permanent punishments that are meted out to people who are returning, people who are immigrants, LGBTQ folk, non-binary folk? How is it that we can address these permanent punishments? It's always been a question for me.
Thank you. For, please continue, please.
Diana, Jimena?
I'm thinking that criminal justice reform is just so difficult because it's so easy to kind of instill fear of the criminal in people. I think that attitudes towards like criminalization really go hand in hand with the normalization of permanent punishment. I think we see it a lot, at least in New York, in the way that well, this isn't permanent punishment, but even eliminating cash bail is like super controversial, and the response to it is like, oh, we're letting criminals run wild in the streets. And I don't feel like that when people kind of push this panic, it's pushed back enough. And so I think it's really about the normalization of like not just the law, but the reactions to changes in the law that really has to be monitored. I know that the mere suggestion of like a pathway to citizenship like sends people completely wild. So I think that like the cultural work is definitely part of it, on top of the legal work.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, I think you brought up a great point, Jimena. You know, especially like a lot of immigrant communities, right? Like if you're labeled a criminal, then therefore you're not worthy of, you know, fulfilling a life. You're, you know, and that's also like goes along with like that like anti-Blackness, right? That exists in our communities. And that's all like part of the system of like allowing this violence to continue, right? Pinning people, communities against each other. And so I think that's a great point.
Right.
I agree. I think that a lot of immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, are willing to see their own status as a necessity, as something they had to do to find a better life, but they don't extend that kind of kindness or tolerance to folks who may have committed some sort of crime to better their own lives. I think it's so interesting how they don't, like, even though the criminalization is so forced upon them, that they will do their best to like disassociate themselves from criminalization, and that just kind of puts prevents like anybody who's advocating for immigrants and anybody who's advocating for criminal justice reform from like collaborating often, because like I said, it's cultural too. There's so much of it is the culture of our own communities.
Yes. And that's oftentimes stopped us from working together because of the way in which criminal is seen or criminalization is seen. I began this work 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And even though many people experience the same thing, it was always, well, one group is better than the other. In the way of being or culturally acceptable, or, you know, and so we have to learn how to fight against that way of how we're defined as people or within our culture as being more acceptable from one to the other. And it's a hard fight. It's a hard fight. It's gotten better. It's gotten better. And as things have gotten worse, it's gotten better. And it's unfortunate that things had to get worse before they begin to get better for other people to see. However, the violence that we continue to see that is met out to women and girls and folks inside and behind the walls, those stories that we don't hear until folks come home, you know, immigration and behind the walls, families being separated. We don't hear about those stories clearly and truthfully until people are either taken from those environments and have a different place to live, and maybe even so after that, not even wanting to talk about it because it's so egregious. How do we get to a place of where we can actually work together as people, genuinely, inclusively, knowing that these issues impact us all?
Thank you so much for elaborating on this particular question as it pertains to the criminal legal system and immigration, and describing your experience, also historical, information that would bring more context to this conversation and topic. I do want to highlight and thank, some of our guests that have chimed in and have given some further feedback. For instance, Nancy Fortunato has offered that it continues to root back to slavery. And Yusuf again has offered that the normal reaction to changes in laws, the fallacy of the average. Perhaps you'd like to continue to expound on that as well, Yusuf. We do want to be mindful of that. And Nancy has also responded and said that they must be accountable to these harmful systems. Yes, those that are in power to change policy, right? And Tina, you did bring up a great point that each state is almost like an individual island of its own. And up until recently, with regard to even New York State, as of 2018, the raise the age implementation, the policy raise the age has been implemented. And prior to 2018, New York State was one of two states in the United States to still charge individuals, young folks, 16 years of age as adults. And the majority of people being impacted by the criminal legal system are those identifying as Black and Latinx young people, the highest number of young people, including women, and the harm and violence against women within prison walls. So, and we know these are layered and complex issues, but as we've all been discussing, it's important that we're bringing this to the forefront and that the unity is there, because even within these systems, there is a thought and a psychology that's that's presented in which, you know, we want to continue to divide people of color and to think that, you know, we want to do so well because we want to be acknowledged as documented. And if you're arrested, there's a stigma, and, you know, keeping folks based off of, you know, colorism separated. And so we're here to break those barriers. So thank you for bringing that up. And I know these are such complex layered issues, but this is why we're here, right? As a committee to help bring this space and awareness. So we're going to continue on with our questions. So we've already touched upon a little bit about, you know, how are ways in which violence shows up in the criminal legal system and immigration. Now, how are we actually connecting to these issues today in our society?
I want to give an example, and I want to continuously go back to how it is that we as people need to, and this is what's so amazing about Jack, is that we are such a diverse group of folks. And with the addition of Xena and Diana just recently, I've you know, you have certain lenses on, and you expand your lens when you're introduced to different experiences in different worlds. And they've brought a particular experience that I've just enjoyed. And so I just want to say how much of an honor it is to be with them in this circle. However, I know that as we continue to have these conversations, we have them in our own little bubble. How is it that we can extend these conversations outside? And this is one way that we're doing so. And I'm really happy that we are. So one of the things, to answer your question, is what we're doing, what Jack is doing, how we're addressing it, how we're having these difficult conversations, how we're extending ourselves beyond our circle to others so that they can hear what it is that we're talking about and hear what it is that we're grappling with. A friend of mine, again, in Illinois, experienced incarceration. She was incarcerated for over 20 years. She had experienced violence from being strip searched. Her and 25 other women were strip searched in the prison, and male officers viewed them. They bought a case. They won their case. Her and 8 women won this case against the corrections in Illinois, Cook County. And the idea that they won that case was phenomenal, that these 8 women stood up against these officers who had certainly impacted them violently. And so when she had come home, soon after the case was won, they were given a monetary award of $325 for the cost of dignity of being strip searched twice inside the prison in front of men. The lawyer that she had was not averse in criminal legal experience, and encouraged her to sign the papers so that the women that she'd left behind would have money for their commissary. So reluctantly she signed, and she said to me, "Tina, $325 is the cost of my dignity." And so when we think about dignity, and we think about how these systems continue to do this, this wasn't something that happened 10 years ago. This just happened recently in the last 3 years. When we think about these systems and how we're impacted by immigration and the demonization and the egregious pain and trauma that they inflict on folks, how is it that we can mend ourselves, heal ourselves, and become fierce fighters against these systems? And Xena is doing that. I applaud you, Xena. And Diana, I just applaud who you are and where you stand. And everyone in Jack, So how is it that we can continue to bring these stories to the forefront and to share them, however, also become activated and activate others? That's my question to you. I know I took a long time.
No, thank you so much, Tina. And before I continue to invite both Ximena and Diana to expand on their thoughts and feedback, I do want to give a moment to our guests to engage with us on this topic or this particular question. So again, how is it that we're seeing these issues today? Any questions? Any questions from our guests? I'm going to check and make sure that I didn't miss anything.
While we do that, I just wanted to bring up a point, and I think this is something that I know Ximena is gonna, agree with, as well as like the remembering like why people are like why immigrants are in this country in the first place, right? So the historical context of U.S. intervening in foreign countries, right? We most recently seen it in Haiti, right? About why is it like that? There was an influx of Haitian immigrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border because of the intervention, and continue connecting those. That's something that I want to definitely bring to the table, but also like continue connecting these issues to today. The removing the children from parents and from communities is part of like that child welfare system where we're removing the future generations, right? We're disconnecting people to their communities and cultures. And this is what some communities across the US live in, that fear and that violence due to their immigration status. Some other point that we've talked about, because this is not the first time that, I know this is a more formal time, but that a part of the advisory committee is that we continue to have these conversations all the time. And that what's really good about having these conversations is that we're, like Tina mentioned, we're seeing it from different lenses and different points of being like, oh, that's the same thing that's happening over here, or maybe in a different way, but that's also violent. And so we, just bringing those up, the lack of accessibility when those communities do live in fear to basic needs, right? I talked about reproductive health, Texas, right? With the new laws against abortion, like that families can't access that reproductive health or other needs such as getting food or going to doctor's office. And again, the reason why I bring this up is because I know what that was like growing up. And it's very frustrating that it still continues to happen. And that may be something I experienced maybe 5, 10, not even 5, 8 years ago, but I know families in that situation today. So that's something else that I wanted to bring up, how it's showing up today.
Thank you for that. You brought up such incredible points, especially as we saw such violent images, as you mentioned, Diana, with Haitian folks working desperately to cross the border, and how these individuals were on horses with whips, children passing in the arms of their parents, and such violent, it's another modern day picture. As I think Ximena, you brought up border control and the slave catchers and how that's showing up as of like last week or a couple weeks back and currently today. And then the children primarily of communities of color being ripped away from their mothers, and for mothers that are unable to and fathers, but that we're seeing historically mothers of color that are unable to fully provide within their guidelines for their children. They're also being ripped away from grandparents and the structure of home. And what does a home like? What does the home structure look like in our homes and in our communities? Therefore, saying this, yeah. Please,
I guess I wanted to add that family separation is definitely a kind of attack on the future. It's meant to kind of create a permanent destabilization of young Black and brown kids. I think that that rooted in slavery, of course, because Black families weren't allowed to be created, and because they weren't allowed to be created, they couldn't. It was harder. I think it's harder to advocate for yourself if you don't have like family. That's like something I don't think about, considering I don't have family in the United States. But further, I think that family separation, as it shows, for example, during the war on drugs, it demonstrates how there was an investment not just in locking people up immediately, but ensuring that the next generation is unprepared and kind of left alone. I think that that was definitely the intention of the war on drugs. And I think that such is the intention of family separation and like the increased deportations, because I feel sometime in the 90s, the powers that be started to realize that the Latinx population and the immigrant population was getting too big. And so they were like, well, we have to ruin these people's futures too. How do we do that? We need to separate their families as much as possible, especially because public support for the war on drugs is waning. We need a new like scheme to lock people up. So I think family separation achieves the purpose of preserving wealth and power among white people for sure, because this isn't happening to white children in these mass scales or in these intentional scales. And if anything, white children are not experiencing the like incredible divestment by the government. This happens to only to children whose parents are already being affected by the system. So it's a method of self-preservation by like the white elites of this country. But that's not to really like remove, I guess, the ways that people find themselves supporting these kinds of systems. I think Diana bringing up the Texas abortion law and how it puts particularly immigrant women in a dangerous position. I also think about the fact that most immigrants in Texas oppose abortion. So I think that like I've said before, like the culture definitely has to change among people who are being targeted, because it's easy, I feel sometimes, to just kind of say, which it is white supremacy, but how are we helping? I think that in many ways, like when we neglect the experiences, or at least in the immigrant advocacy side, when we neglect the experience or ignore the experiences of Black folks currently, and when we don't show up for police violence, that we are supporting white supremacy, whether we're white or not. Like I mentioned before, like it is not uncommon for an immigrant who's being called a criminal to be like, I'm not like those other people. So I really like keep an eye out for that too, because it also makes accountability harder. Tina had brought up accountability, and it's like it's harder to hold people accountable when the people we're trying to hold accountable can use our own communities against us.
And that's unfortunate, because even in our conversations, and I want to just remark on a chat response to how oftentimes, and in the past especially, people who had committed violent crimes versus folks who were nonviolent, and how that terminology, the definition of both sides, really worked against the movement, because people actually who were out there doing work in a violent environment were trying to find ways in which they could fit in. And so they would compare themselves to people who had committed violent crimes, we're ostracizing those folks who were primarily leaders inside and behind the walls, right? And held most folks together, right? And as they sent and shepherded people out who were leaving before them with much education, right? Those folks were met with this conversation that they were better than or more suitable to be in circles, which is not true. And so, you know, we need to be mindful of how it is that we're pitted against each other, because the system has made all of this up, and the way in which people have been defined as invisible, as numbers, as better than. We have to take over those conversations, because we'll never get to the bottom of it. We'll never get to the trauma. We'll never get to the real issues of violence within these systems that continue to go on and be perpetuated on our people.
Thank you so much for this feedback. I want to highlight a lot of what's being shared in our chat. Nancy Fortunato says, people came into this country with the hopes of a better life, but soon come to find out it's not what it looks like or sounds like. And Judith Clark responded to Yusuf's comment, as someone who served the long sentence for a violent crime with many others, also serving long sentences for violent crimes, we are also more than the worst moment or act of our lives. We are the mainstay of positive community inside and when we get out. Most of us are products of trauma, which Tina just highlighted as well. So please try not to reinforce the dichotomy between violent and nonviolent offenses, which has been used to reinforce the punishment paradigm. And thank you, Ximena, as well, for highlighting, you know, the history of and the tactic, you know, that was utilized by our government with the war on drugs and how it has affected many communities. I know for a fact, I grew up in New York City in the 80s, 90s, and saw how Harlem and the Bronx and Brooklyn and Staten Island, certain areas, but our city was heavily impacted by this because we were a growing number, all right? The Latinx community, you know, the Black American community and Caribbean community. And I do want to continue to highlight that Nancy did say the world is rooted in white supremacy. LM, please pardon for not saying your full name, but you did express if enthusiasm for the war on drugs is waning, as one speaker says, then what is the next big boogeyman for the criminal legal system? That's a really interesting question.
That's a really interesting question.
What do you all have to say?
That's a really interesting question. I've taken the lead on many of these answers, folks, so I'm going to step back and then comment after you.
I think because there was because the drugs won the war on drugs, I think that the criminal legal system has definitely relied on immigration. If you look at like how profitable the system of immigration became as soon as the war on drugs started to wind down. So immigrants technically, I mean, we're always a boogeyman, but I think that post 9/11, like the treatment of the immigrant as the terrorist has really replaced what somebody in the 90s would have called people super predators. But I also feel like what we are seeing now is a criminal justice systems targeting like anarchists and abolitionists for their actual, for what they say, because these systems are threatened by abolitionists. I think that the protests last year, I think it was very scary to see how many people wanted to discount when a community set something on fire and how many people jumped to say, oh, these are instigators, these are infiltrators, instead of a community demonstrating its righteous anger. But I think that the criminal legal system recognizes that space, that they can capitalize on that space where people don't want to believe that the oppressed masses are so angry they're willing to set something on fire. And I think that as more people espouse this kind of very anarchist rhetoric, this kind of anti-government rhetoric, that with the help of technology, that's definitely like where a lot of people are going to start getting locked up, I feel. I feel an effort to kind of like focus on domestic terrorism because the government can't deny the white supremacist gangs running around everywhere. But that's a wonderful opportunity for the government to also lock up Black liberation fighters and anybody who they deem too radical.
I'm actually going to take a slight different answer to this. The next big thing that I'm seeing is, and I feel like is going to be for like, is the criminalization of mental health. You know, on top of everything else, we just went through almost 2 years of isolation, and there's a lot of people that are not doing okay and are trying to like weed back into society. You know, everybody's on their own journey, but the ones that are really suffering a lot is our students who are already in these under-resourced communities, who schools are not knowing how to respond to these needs, right? It's not something new, but now it's in bigger numbers, right? Like we're not having conversations with kids about what it was like for them. We're expecting them to go back to school and function as if nothing happened in the past year and a half. So I'm really concerned to that because as I mentioned, I was like my current work, I saw throughout the pandemic, people who were like having like the worst day of their life and helping them navigate that, right? And now their interaction with the criminal legal system. And, you know, and also seeing from firsthand experience, like the kids that I care for, right? Through their own like journey of like navigating that. So those are that, I think for me, that's like the next like boogeyman or the next targeted audience, because we ourselves are already limited in those resources. And so what does it look like when we're trying to help the next generation or even ourselves, right, come out of this mental health?
Absolutely. And sorry.
That's okay.
Tanya.
I don't think it's one particular issue. I think there's enough going on right now where all of these issues that we're talking about, with the overlapping experience and of isolation, and as we come out of it, with anger, unanswered questions, people living with mental health issues, and I think that there are enough things that are happening right now. We look at immigration, we look at reproductive choice, we look at children and education, we look at the systems that are denying people housing. We have a plethora of issues that will definitely connect with the criminal legal system, and has and is, and it's been started, and it's not something that is one or the other. You know, you think about, so I have to mention this. On October 17th, there was a woman on a train that was raped by a homeless man. And people took out their phones and supposedly did nothing to help this woman. The prosecutor, 2 days afterwards, argued that he didn't feel people helped her. However, there was no help for this woman. That people were actually more interested in taking a video of what was happening than assisting her. when there was a trained person that finally came to her rescue, right? That was when the whole situation ended. Now, people can say whatever they want to say about, and Jimena, I believe you mentioned this in the beginning, how social media plays a big part. But I think that we are so bombarded with so much trauma, the normalization of violence. We are now becoming so out of touch with violence. It can be right next to us and we won't do anything. We won't do anything. And that's scary. So we have systems that respond to violence in a way where it needs to be held back so that there are people who are appropriate to address these issues, such as mental health, mental illness, homelessness, right? Violence in the subways. We know that the police are not the folks that should be answering these questions, that should be answering these calls. So how is it that we are really looking at all of these issues and identifying one or two? We have to look at all of them and know that they are right there in front of us. And they are what's leading us into a different way of seeing the criminal legal system. It's going to look totally different. There are going to be more youth. There are going to be more people who have lost the right to choose. There are going to be more homeless people. Certainly immigration has its own system that's going on. And people harmed and traumatized and have violence meted out to them. Those are my thoughts. I just don't think it's one thing.
Thank you. It's actually many things that are deeply rooted with violence, and how we're and also I would even offer, and also how our current society within our country is so highly connected to this view of like capitalism and what's important. And this notion of social media, we have literally at our fingertips, we have the power to empower or disempower. And it goes back to the root of accountability. This issue that happened with this unfortunate tragedy, it's tragic, and it's a clear example of violence against women, that we would allow in broad daylight such a heinous act to occur, right? And then this individual, this homeless person, mentally, how are we addressing that? We know that this current pandemic has affected so many individuals mentally, with isolation, also with, how are we making best use of our facilities when it comes to obviously folks that are physically ill, but then mentally ill, we're just discarding them into the streets. I know this is extremely layered, and I'm so grateful that we're putting this out in the forefront. I want to also include some of the comments. We have one that was offered by one of our JAC members, Tanya, in response to our question, how are we seeing the effects of violence today? And Tanya has also offered, I have also questioned how dreamers are automatically disqualified from attempting to gain citizenship if they have unfortunately had contact with the justice system. It doesn't sit right with me that a child brought here that makes a mistake doesn't get a chance. And then we have Emmett Blount sharing, I think the real tragedy is this whole system wasn't built or designed for people of color. So as the years go on, by decades and decades, the privileged do not really see the oppression we go or have been through. It's an experience they will never have, and I believe never will. Sure, there are some that empathize with our oppression, but they never truly have the same oppression, discrimination, and hatred as us. And I do want to highlight also what LM has expressed. have any speakers or people they know experienced surveillance abuse and or COINTELPRO organized methods to harass, which can include multi-party stalking, revenge porn, and work blacklisting? I know that's rather layered, and if any of our Jack members would like to express on that. And there's so many important points being listed, so just one moment. Questions for presenters as well by Andrea. How do we turn incidences that we encounter to interventions? So I know I brought up some questions here, but perhaps Tina, Ximena, or Diana, you'd like to share specific answers to any of these questions.
I love the COINTELPRO question because I have a lot of theories about how, it's not theories, it's I think very obvious how the within the immigrant rights movement, they don't have any fear or concern about any type of COINTELPRO tactics whatsoever. They think that if they protest and hold the sign, the government will leave them alone. Whereas I believe that many nonprofits themselves are functioning as the COINTELPRO, and they do report back directly to government officials on what the tactics are, what the plans are. And a lot of these nonprofits will call it, collaborating with elected officials. But from the way I see it, it's very much like, no, you're directly you're snitching on everyone to the government. I think that, and this is something that drives me completely mad, but people don't realize that one of the most prominent immigrant rights organizations in the country, also known as Forward.us, was created and is fully funded by Mark Zuckerberg. And it's the people at Forward.us that will be the only ones being invited to meetings with elected officials, and will be having coalition meetings with Republicans and the DHS people and this and that. So when I'm telling you that, like, they don't need to do any COINTELPRO because it's the nonprofits themselves directly snitching to the government. And to the point of blacklisting, I've been blacklisted for mentioning the fact that organizations like Forward are owned by Mark Zuckerberg. So not only do they like engage with organizations that are owned by the ops, because there's just absolutely no way that you can look at Mark Zuckerberg and say he is in the side of justice. Beyond organizing directly with the ops, they actively attack and blacklist the people who point this out. That is exactly what the immigrant rights movement is, and which is why I'm just like, don't trust them, y'all. Don't trust all of them.
Thank you so much. We have a few more minutes for another question. I am thinking about escalating criminalization of bodies and reproductive rights, as we've seen in Texas. How do you think this political movement can be an opportunity to align the movement needs between the feminist and TGNC sectors?
I mean, one of the things aligning, right? And I myself mess up on this is language, right? Language is very powerful. And again, language in history has been used to separate and isolate people over and over. And so it's important as we're thinking about like reproductive rights, right? And there's some like people out there who are very like outspoken about this, about using the right language, and not alienating the TGNC sectors. And I know sometimes we do this to try to be in the word of exclusiveness. And sometimes, we ask ourselves as like we're learning, and like this is part of the advisory council, that we're learning from each other. And so how do we continue like It's okay to not know the answer. It's okay to listen to your colleague or to your the person from who's bringing a different perspective, and it's okay to be wrong. That's one way I think that we continue to align.
Thank you, Diana. Do we have any further comments regarding some of these questions? Let's see if there is time for perhaps.
I wanted to add, it's crucial for the reproductive rights topic to include trans people and to acknowledge the fact that not only women get pregnant. And I think that sheer fact is just so earth-shattering for a lot of people who call themselves feminists. And not only women can get pregnant, and that's just it. But I also think that the framing often around abortion rights and reproductive rights, it kind of accepts the conservative framing. So I saw kind of this discussion where it's like, don't call yourself pro-abortion, call yourself like pro-women's rights, because and it's like, no, call yourself pro-abortion. Because when we accept the like opponent's framing, and when we accept the fact that they call themselves pro-life, even though they're clearly not, when we accept their framing, we exclude people. So when they say, well, we're pro-life, when we say no, we're like pro-choice, pro-women's rights. It's like, can't we just say we're pro-abortion, and that includes people who are not women? I think it's a lot of trying to like meet the ops halfway, and it's like, we don't need to do that.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Ximena. I also want to highlight as we move on that Andrea Williams offered that we insist with mainstream women's organizations that the murders of Black women who are transgender is violence against women, and to take action. So thank you. Thank you so much. We are going to continue to move on to our third question. And I'm so excited. I mean, our chat is just super like interactive. So please, this is what we want. Thank you. Thank you. How are we actually trying to dismantle these disruptive systems? This question to Tina, Ximena, and Diana. In your experience, how do you think today we're actually working to actually dismantle?
One of the things that I find that is really interesting when we think about people who've been traumatized is their sharing of their stories. The opportunity for folks to share their stories and for their stories to really make an impact. And we have social media that allows us to share ourselves, to establish podcasts, to bring people on to and into conversations, that the more of sharing stories, being honest and having difficult conversations will help dismantle some of these issues, or at least begin a conversation around how to begin to dismantle. Folks are terribly desensitized, to a lot of things that are happening, because we live in such an individualistic society that it's about taking care of oneself first. However, if we look at the impact of these various systems and issues, then we find that all of us are impacted by them. As as an example, COVID. Like Diana said, isolation, COVID, sickness, death, that has brought us to a place of where we have to assess or reassess our ability, our mainstay, who we are, our sense of being. And we need to have those conversations, like Diana said, with our children, with our community. We really need to have these conversations. And as we are now more coming back into those, our community, our families, we're able to visit. these difficult conversations of what's happened in the last 18 months need to happen. We need to really have these conversations and use the various or access the various ways in which we can use to get our stories out, to make it meaningful. I mean, I think that we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of healing to do, you know, and that's my two cents.
Thank you so much, Tina. And just before Ximena and Diana continue, I want to continue to welcome our guests to participate. If you would like to speak and share or ask a question, please do raise your hand. We do have many of our JAC members moderating in our chat, and you will be unmuted. So please, we want you to chime in. Thank you for being so interactive in our chat. We also want to also create space to actually hear your voice and your thoughts as well. Diana and Ximena, you may continue as well.
Yeah. So this question, are we trying to dismantle? I took it like on a small scale, on a personal scale. So, you know, I was in the immigrant rights movement, and I, you know, decided that for now, like my home is like the Bronx, and this is where like the change that I want to focus my efforts in. And part of that, you know, being able to like have an understanding of where for yourself, right? What does change look like? Why are you trying to dismantle? And for me, that's here in like the community that I live and grow, and also see all these issues interject and come to life in not such a beautiful way. So for me, that's that. And, you know, for personally, it's learning about like restorative justice, practicing restorative justice, having those tough conversations, thinking about the issues from that perspective of what are the root causes, what is needed to heal. For me, it's doing that work here in the Bronx as part of like the New York City community. That's my answer.
Thank you, Diana. Mm-hmm.
Since I started law school, I've kind of been doing not as much organizing as before, but I think before what I would focus on was political education, particularly of like recently released trans immigrants. I don't know if this helps so much as I wish it would, but I just think that when people are released from prison detention, some of the many resources they need is understanding that they were in a system, and that they have that, like, what the system means. I think a lot of people don't know can't make sense of what they just experienced, and how society would let them experience such horrible things without fighting for them. And I think what I can do for people is kind of share that knowledge and education. And of course, I mean, more than anything, people just need money. So mutual aid efforts are just always really important. I get very sad when I see a headline about some politician raising millions of dollars. When I see people released from incarceration always struggling, there's always somebody on my timeline who needs support. I think that's I think like a lot of people may underestimate just how like important simply giving people money is, especially for people released from prison. I think that because of the criminalization, people are very hesitant to give somebody released from prison $1,000 cash, but that's often what they need to get their get everything back in order. I think it's very interesting how like mutual aid efforts, I don't know, like they're much easier when you're dying from a disease than you are just like a person neglected by the state.
Thank you, Ximena, and thank you again, Diana. I do want to open it up for our guests to share their thoughts too on how they're all viewing how we're how we're actually trying to dismantle these current systems. Anybody would like to share verbally? You can raise your hand and you can be unmuted. No? All right, Yusuf.
One person.
I was waiting for someone else. I didn't want to be the first one to chime in, but first of all, excellent discussion. Thank you, Rhea, for the invitation. You know, she was posting it all day in Slack, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna go to this. Ximena sort of like cracked it wide open when she began talking about the 13th Amendment and the system of slavery in the United States. I happen to be a founding member of the Abolish Slavery National Network. And, you know, through our efforts, we've entered anti-slavery legislation into the constitutions of 4 states, and coming next year, we'll have 22 additional states. Many people just think that slavery has been abolished by the 13th Amendment, but we know historically what they've done is they transitioned it into convict leasing, chain gangs, and all the way up to the modern day prison industrial complex. And many of the issues are tied into that 13th Amendment, whether we realize it or not. I mean, when you talk about kids for cash, when they're doing all of the school to prison pipeline, the medical industrial complex or the treatment industrial complex, it's so many things that tie into it. And so we've been able to actually get Senator Merkley of Oregon and many others where we have the proposed 28th Amendment to remove the exception clause from the 13th Amendment. It was actually introduced on Juneteenth, and that's why Biden made the announcement that Juneteenth was going to be a federal holiday. It was sort of like trying to undercut what we were doing, you know, but we actually have this proposed amendment in, we have this proposed amendment on the Senate floor and on the House floor at the moment. And what removing the exception clause would do is open the door to addressing the 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and 19th Amendment violations that occur every single day in the courtrooms in corporate America. It's happening all over the place, but it's disguised in law. And then we know when it comes to incarceration, there are 80,000 collateral consequences to incarceration. You know, many of what Tina was speaking about earlier when she was speaking about in Illinois, I think she said 1,158. There's so many collateral consequences. And then you top it off with poverty, you top it off with underfunded schools, targeted racism, targeted discrimination, bigotry, whatever terms you want to use. It's all tied into the 13th Amendment. And I'm going to do a shameful plug right now. I have a podcast every Sunday. It's called Abolition Today. You can find us at abolitiontoday.org. We also have our podcast. We're on all podcast platforms. We're on YouTube, youtube.com/abolitiontoday. I'd love to have you 4 ladies on one of our shows, you know, so please reach out to us at abolitionistcenter@gmail.com, because these are the types of conversations that we have all the time. You know, with I think it was Diana that said it, that Yusuf, please place in ethics chat. I'm not sure what they means by that. But I think it was Diana that mentioned just giving the people the opportunity to speak. I forget who said it. Someone said just having a platform where people can speak. It begins there, because we we give people an opportunity to speak and also educate on these topics, because this was a very important topic that occurred today. And again, I'm just grateful that I was invited to it, and I'll turn the mic back over because I can talk for hours, so just thank you.
Yusuf, yes, this is amazing. This is what we want. I'm learning so much, even for what you've expressed and what you've been offering, the world. Please, please drop that information on how to access the podcast for Abolition Today. I know that I wrote it down, but we want to make sure that this isn't just a conversation, but that we can share resources and ways in which we could become more aware of, the amendments that are being challenged to change. So please, for our information, and so that we can continue to share this, share on. So thank you. No, thank you for sharing and speaking. This is exactly what we want. I also want to recognize that Andrea Williams has her hand up. Andrea, please, we welcome you to share.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. I wanted to thank you so much for this discussion. I wanted to just connect to some of the different points that were made around things that I speak to when it comes to normalization of violence against women, like interventions and how we move away from the things that we as individuals in a society are doing now to doing something different. So one was a discussion about mutual aid, which I think is so important. And I agree that we've been conditioned to think that we have to look to kind of big systems and big money to take care of each other when we take care of each other every day, which is what Xena, I think you were speaking to, right? And that I think we have to remind each other as an intervention and a practice to take some personal responsibility and say, like, how can I help and what can I do for somebody today? Like, if I have something, looking intentionally for somebody who might need something and giving and trying to help in whatever way we can. And people do that all the time, but I just think that as a practice, it's important that we do that. I remember one friend of mine said that to exercise that muscle, she said a person suggested to her, just give away your money every day. Whatever change you have, whatever dollars, because you get yourself used to giving, right? And not hesitating. The other point I wanted to connect to was about this Tina, I think you were talking about this, where when you brought up the Brave case, when people see and stand back and film instead of doing something. I really, my mom's in a care facility and I go to feed her at lunch. And so I see Eyewitness News every day. The amount they put on violence against people every day, feeding the public in order to make sure that they get viewers. And I remember there was one very recent where a woman was assaulted on the street. A guy came behind her, put his hands in her pants and assaulted her and then ran away. They kept showing that. 12 o'clock noon. This is the kind of stuff that we need to protest. This is the kind of stuff that gets people used to seeing folks being assaulted and killed and things like that. So I just think it's important. You have to protest these things when they show up and say, it's not acceptable. We don't want to see it like this. You can do something, but don't just show it to get viewers, right? And then the third thing I'll say is, and this was my question about interventions, and I think interventions speak to practices. Like when we look at harm reduction strategies, when we look at mutual aid, all those kind of things, I think that those are the kinds of things that it's important to talk to the community about. People won't necessarily, some people know the term harm reduction, some people know the term mutual aid, but I think we can just talk about the things that we can do to help people. And we do that in spaces with everybody because we have COVID now as an example. We're not going to make it unless all of us make it, right? We have to start to really amplify the strategies to move away from the individual and get to the collective care and community. That's where we need to get, you know? And so, and we have to understand what we're seeing. In my neighborhood, I live in a nice neighborhood. I see people, it's not people coming, and when the recycles are put out, people are coming along and getting those plastic bottles so they can turn them in, right? This is in a pretty well-off neighborhood, right? Things are tight for a lot of people. And so I'm making these connections because I just think that interventions and practice that move us from the things that we are doing now to the different thing that we want to see is key. That is key. It's key in moving us away from the normalization of violence against women and others, and some of the other issues that people are talking about. And I'll just end with this. And I think this connects with another point that you were making too. That folks do need to be educated about systems. You know, these systems are the water that we swim in. Some people don't understand that it's a matrix, you know, that it's a box, that it's a system. They think that it's just what is. And you really have to talk to some people and say, well, and challenge that and get them to see it differently. And so in any spaces that we can do that outside of, in the community across the board with family and friends, I just think is really, really important, because that's the only way that we're gonna move towards more collective care and away from the very deep conditioning on all these things that we have all been subjected to. So thank you for allowing me the mic and some space to share and with you and engage with you on some of the important points that you raised.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This is exactly why we've collectively agreed to present this event. Thank you for your insight. It's so needed. We want to continue to encourage to have this platform, an opportunity for individuals to discuss, as Tina and the rest of our JAC members who are presenting today have highlighted. We need to begin this discussion and also collaborate and share what we're currently doing today to address these issues. And I personally just feel extremely honored to have you all here participating and joining us in this conversation. So thank you again, Andrea. Thank you, Yusuf. I'm not sure if Latrice, you wanted to also share any comments or join us in with some of your insight. If you stepped away for a moment or you're unavailable to share at this moment, I do want to take Latrice, we will give you a few moments if you'd like to come whenever you're ready. I do want to take a moment to read some comments left by LM and Emmett. I know, Emmett, earlier you shared that I am not gender shaming as I am a man, but ultimately women are the lifeline to this whole society and world, hence the term Mother Earth. They should be treated and held as if they are royalty. If we never recognize that, our society will eventually perish. And LM, you did share, Fusion centers have allegedly placed some people on a list for organized harassment. This can include professional blacklisting, neighborhood slander and defamation, revenge porn, multi-party and interstate stalking, and financial sabotage, and electronic harassment with directed energy weapons. For more information, you may want to read up on a group called Advocacy for Humankind. Emmett, you also shared dismantling includes social media, everyday conversations, reverse setting talks, for example, putting yourself in their shoes, statistics, community reach outs, public support, mental and physical health access and assistance with support, employment, and back on track programs.
Mhm.
So thank you for sharing that. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Will this meeting be made available? We are recording it, so you all will get a copy of this recorded session with us. So yes, thank you, thank you. Latrice, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, Pimena, pardon.
I'm sorry, I had a question for the other panelists, and you wanted to answer it. If that's all right. I guess Andrea had brought up the proliferation of violent videos. Something I noticed last year was the George Floyd video was a catalyst for a lot of people, but I also noticed that a lot of especially non-Black folks, when they were told please stop sharing this very traumatic image, there was a very sharp reaction to people saying that, and it was usually along the lines of I'm trying to raise awareness. And I think it's important to recognize that like this country has a history of enjoying the visuals of the torture and pain of non-white people, of Black folks particularly. And I myself didn't share the video because of this kind of history, but I know for many people it's so important to share these videos to spread awareness, as they would say. And I think since we were talking, and Tina had brought up that people need to share their story, I wanted to ask how you feel about the proliferation of these videos, or do you believe that storytelling can come in a way that doesn't always center the violence people experience?
I mean, one, I don't think I'm the best person. Best person to answer that, but one strategy that I think is different than sharing like the visual of that violence against particularly Black folks, but non people of color, I think is centering the stories around what was the impact on that person versus like the violence. Like we all know, well, I guess back to your raising awareness, right? Some people don't believe this exists. Some people have no clue, live on another planet and are coming here. And so I agree that I also like didn't share the videos because there was something about it that just didn't sit right when those times when that was happening. But I know that it's important for me to talk about what's happening. And you know, I come from Latinx Mexican culture. That was on Univision, Telemundo, Primer Impacto, out there, because unfortunately some folks, that's the only way that they'll stop and sit and talk about it. And I'm not saying these are like fruitful conversations, but in those moments, it's, I think as a person that like comes from a different awareness or different lens than maybe the like community I'm sitting with at the moment, I think it's important to be like, you know, let's stop that, because one, it's not really helping anyone. It's actually saying like little by little that violence is okay. And I think that's what like normalize, that's what like, you know, I think you're bringing up, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, like when we're like, when we see it on the news every day, we're like, oh, that's nothing new. If we see it, going back to Tina, what you had brought up, like we're seeing it, we're it's part of daily life. And so when an incident of violence happened, we don't think anything of it. We were like, it's part of life. And so I think it is important to stop in those moments. And for that reason, you know, I'm like, I'm not watching certain channels anymore. And then when, you know, the work that we're doing on a day-to-day on our small communities, being like, let's talk about this instead of let's see this actively on the news over and over again.
Thank you for that, Diana. So the proliferation of violent videos or videos, I think that we've become accustomed to video taping and observing. We've kind of taken on the voyeur stance in many ways, right? And so I want to be clear about this incident that I mentioned on the 17th. My understanding of who this person was, and it doesn't really matter who she was, what she looked like. However, to me, that's my stance. To others, it may very well matter whether that is a person of color or a person of color who attacked her. And that's the reality of it. That many people will not address violence when it's a person of color acting out violently on another person of color. And that's the truth. That's unfortunate in many cases. However, I'm not sure what exactly happened with this young lady, but I do know that folks have different ways of responding to violence. And we definitely need to have a conversation or conversations about how it is that we are apathetic to violence, or we are normalizing violence. And no matter who it's meted out to, that why wouldn't we respond physically with a response, you know? So I want to mention something. When you maybe 10, 15 years ago, Worth was advocating for the end of shackling in New York. And we were meeting at our coalition meeting and everyone was there. We had done some outreach and then maybe we did a lobby day before. We didn't have much of a reaction that we had wanted from this direct action. However, a photographer that was a part of the conversation identified himself as an ally, asked us what would we think about having women lined up and sitting on the sidewalk in front of the mayor's office with handcuffs and shackles on. And we were upset. We were like, how dare you, you know, want us to give an example of an actual experience of trauma, violence, abuse for us to get our point across. However, we thought about it, and some of the women who were at the table who were not Black volunteered to be shackled and handcuffed in front and sit down on the sidewalk with pillows under their t-shirts and in front of the governor's office. And instead of standing out in front of the governor's office with just placards saying, you know, women are being shackled and handcuffed, we had a visual. And I don't think if these women had volunteered that many people would have stopped, because at that point, people really didn't know that women were shackled and handcuffed during labor and delivery. And people stopped. People started asking questions. People said, I didn't even know women went to prison pregnant, you know, and so it made a great impact. I believe that the way we use social media, in any way, and whatever the content is, affects people differently. The George Floyd content, I couldn't watch it and I would never share it with anyone. I couldn't watch it more than the first time I saw it, because for me, it triggered what I'd seen as a young child and experienced. And for others, I can understand it maybe not even affecting folks, you know, and so the reason why I mentioned short storytelling is because that's that person putting a name and a face to that story, that experience, as opposed to someone being invisible and taking a picture of it, right? And offering it for whoever to define, right? We didn't know about the young woman's story who took the picture of George Floyd until afterwards, when the case came up. And then I heard her story, this young girl who took this picture, how hurt and how sad she was. She shared her story. And I only felt pain for her, but I would not have known that pain of actually videotaping that event for her unless she had shared it.
Thank you, Tina, for offering that. I do want to open it up again and give the mic to some of our guests here. I'm not sure if Andrea, you'd like to respond or expand further?
Hi,
Trees?
I did.
Or, hi.
Oh no, I didn't. I didn't have. I just appreciated. The storytelling piece is key. I do think it matters when people talk about their lived experience. And so the other thing I want to say though, Tina, you're sharing the example from the anti-shackling, and I never knew the story behind the picture, right? And it's such a deep intervention, to have who I saw were, the white women volunteering. You described it, right? To be the ones, right? To do the photo. And it's just a great example of turning a lot of things upside down, right? In ways that people use their privilege. So I think I'll just make a plug here to say that there's many ways that people can talk about their experiences. They don't have to just kind of tell everything that happened. People have choice in order to talk about a lived experience to help bring understanding. And I just would add that to all of what Tina and others have said.
Thank you, Andrea. This is
You're
another
welcome.
warm welcome and reminder. Oh, did I interrupt someone? Pardon. Just another reminder that we would like to hear from you. You all that are still here with us, we greatly appreciate to have your time, attention, and your insight. If you have questions, please feel free to place in the chat or raise your hand. You can also ask your question. We will address some of your questions and answers in our next segment, which could begin rather soon. But if there are any further comments presently right now, please share. I'll be looking through now for some questions. Let me see. We have, how do we turn these incidences? We may have already answered some of these questions, but how do we turn these incidences that we encounter to interventions? Anybody else would like to further expand on that?
Well, that was my question. And I think y'all did talk about it. And there was somebody, I think it was LM, who put a lot of examples in what you read around the different interventions and practices that are kind of out there. So I think that was it.
Wonderful, thank you. And actually, I want to pose this question to many of our JAC members who are in attendance. Why is this topic, which there are subtopics in this overall topic of undoing the normalization of violence against women, why is this topic important to you all? And this is specifically for our JAC members that are not on the panel today. Want to give you all an opportunity to jump on the mic. Anissa, thank you.
And I'm sorry, I'm in transit. But I just really wanted to say thank you to all the members on the panel. And thank you for opening it up to other members so that we can actually share some of the, the feelings we have about this issue. And I know for me, as somebody who has experienced violence, not only domestically, but systemically, right, and institutionally, this is an issue because I feel like violence for so long through fear of sharing about violent issues happening in their lives. And so to be able to be in conversation with others and see that I am not alone in this situation and that we can come together and begin to strategize around ways that we can begin to start to undo this violence, right? Really like letting people know that it's happening and what we can do as women, trans women, gender nonconforming people to really end and undo what has been done for so many years to women violently. So I'm just really glad to be in conversation with you all. And I know that Jack members, all of us is working in a field that really is helping individuals who have experienced violence, right? And so and bringing this to the table and hearing from others and doing work in different areas, such as immigration, such as working with LGBTQI, non-conforming folks, and really bringing that together and working collectively to find ways that we can actually work to undo what has been done to so many of us and our ancestors. It's just a powerful, powerful, exciting, and inspiring work to do, right? And people need to know that this is happening, right? And so that we can then continue to do our work. So I thank y'all for letting me speak to y'all today. And I'm glad that we are continuing to work together as Jack so that folks can know who we are and what we do. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anissa. Thank you. We appreciate and value your share back and why this is also important to you. I also want to pass the mic on to Letitia. Letitia, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. You might hear some vibrating in the background. There's some work taking place, so sorry about that. I mean, the issue against undoing violence against women and the normalization of it is super important. There's so many layers when we talk and think about violence against women. They intersect across populations and systems, and to keep the conversation going and for us to continue strategizing, I mean, we have to keep the topic present. We have to keep the topic ongoing and partner with other organizations and each other. What I read this week was, and I'm paraphrasing, it takes one person to do one thing to get everybody else on board to make this bigger thing happen, right? And so it only takes one of us to start to do something and then get a whole community together. And that's what we're doing. I mean, this violence, it's sadly, it's normalized, right? And that's why we continue to have these conversations, because it's historical, it's systemic, and it's rooted in our culture. I think that now is a time to be even louder about it. While we have a person, a woman in office, as Kathy Hochul is there, and she is familiar and playing the side of interest in some of these topics that involve us as women. And I think now is a super important time to just be as loud as possible and continue strategizing and planning and getting to a place where we can involve people that are in place of power to help us make these changes, right? Because we can continue to plan to dismantle, but if we don't have people in place to push our agenda forward, we'll continue to plan, right? And so thank you to Jack members who I sit with every day, and we continue to plan and strategize and keep these topics very evident. We continue to work towards this. And thank you all that have joined us in this conversation. So thank you for opening up the floor to us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Letitia. Any other, we do have a guest, I believe, Cheryl Wilkins. You'd like to ask a question or offer some commentary? Please, let's unmute Cheryl.
Hey, Jack members, thank you for putting on this needed conversation. And yeah, I'm enjoying it. So I just wanted to look at another way of viewing violence, against women and what it means for systemic violence, to occur. I'm looking at when you don't support single mothers, that's violent as hell. When women are inside and men are literally telling you how much toilet paper or sanitary napkins you need, that is a form of violence to me. When a woman has to choose between, going to a program that could support her or has to stay home because they don't have childcare services. All of this to me is a form of violence, and it oppresses women in a way that really forces them to possibly use other coping mechanisms and things like that. And so, I agree with Letitia that it's refreshing to have a woman in place, because, having a man make all of these policies and laws that they know nothing about because they have not been through it. I mean, just the shackling laws, there's no woman on earth that could say that, yeah, keep them shackled while they're having a baby. Come on. No. I mean, and so it's just refreshing to have a woman there. And we're in a moment in time that I think that we need to really take advantage of this time period, because we don't know. But on the other end of this, then we need to just, work on getting other women in places and in power that could support, what we're going through a feminist lens. Thank you.
Powerful. Thank you, Cheryl, for continuing to remind us about how violence could look and looks like, in many of our experiences and those that we come in contact with day to day. And thank you for your insight. I know that I haven't shared very much about why I'm also interested in this conversation. I think that for me personally, it's important that I'm not just focusing on one particular area, and that I can see that I continue to have an open mind as I'm learning more about our communities that identify as women or non-gender conforming. I want to always be present and hold that close so that I'm aware, and that the way that I live day to day offers some kind of shift and change in consciousness, but also physically. I do want to be accountable, and so I greatly appreciate the JAC members that inform me, that challenge my mindset and thinking, and encourage me to grow day to day. So that's I feel honored and privileged that I get to moderate this conversation and learn so much from our members, but also from you all, our guests. And this is definitely part of, I know I can speak for our collective, that this is why we wanted to have this conversation, not a lecture, not just a webinar, but a conversation in which we can all share our experiences on these different subtopics that are deeply rooted, yes, in violence, but also with what we're recognizing, and what would appear we're all in agreement that it really does stem from slavery and this colonial mindset. So thank you. Anissa, I'm not sure if you had raised your hand again a second time, but I do see you. Before, if you would allow me, I want to also pass the mic to any other JAC members that would like to share specifically why this topic is so important. Lolan.
Hey everybody. We're coming up to time, but I just want to say that I think especially for those folks who may be in organizations who don't specifically tackle issues around, or around like women's issues or criminal justice or criminal systems impacted communities issues, that everything is interrelated. And even when we're talking about things like food justice, or we're talking specifically about TG&C communities and their needs, we need to really be able to like see how our issues are interconnected, how our communities actually are relying upon each other. And when we don't align with one another, when we don't think about our work in sort of in the big picture, as part of like this constellation of community and movement, we run the risk of being turned against one another, or having issues that maybe so I see this very much as just a call to arms for us to really build those relationships with those organizations, with those communities who maybe you may not see the direct correlations, but we're all interrelated and need to really, really strengthen and come together. So I'll pause there. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Lolan. And we're about 1 minute away from ending, and we want to honor everyone's schedule and time. I would like to, in closing, I would like to take a moment to truly thank the New York Women's Foundation for allowing us, especially as the Justice Advisory Committee members, to have this conversation, to have this space, this date and time. I want to take a moment to thank our incredible panelists. Thank you for your knowledge, your experience, your insights. And before we close off, thank you all. I'm not sure if we're going to close off. Anybody else? I mean, we have so many that we want to thank here. The rest of our committee, Anissa, Ashley, Barbara, Cynthia, Dinah, Kiki, Letitia, Lolan, me, Naja, Tanya, Tina, Diana, Jimena, and Miss QT. So thank you to all of our guests here today. We appreciate you all, and we will continue having this conversation that will continue to not drive just the narrative, but actionable steps.
Yes, and I wanted to just close out by saying that the New York Women's Foundation it's just been an honor to partner with you all as community members and voices that are needed in the conversation of bringing gender justice to the criminal justice system, which was the main goal of launching the Justice Fund at a critical moment in criminal justice here in New York City. And we continue to really fight to decarcerate and to create a different vision for what we want women and new generations to experience in New York City. So this is one of many fruitful conversations that we share, and many of the projects that you all are engaged in, that we just continue to be in awe of what this advisory committee has been able to accomplish, and just feel fortunate to be in partnership with you all. So thank you for today's conversation. Thank you for everything that you contribute, and the care and this collective care that we talked about today is certainly the way in which we have crafted these programs and these conversations for anyone who's out there. So this will be shared with those who attended, but please share widely. We will feature this in our YouTube channel as well, for folks to continue to listen in and to have, in their memory of what was said here today. So have a great day all, and thank you for coming.
Bye, thank you.
Awesome.